Good morning and welcome to the Dean's Forum with St. John's Cathedral in Denver, Colorado. I'm Richard Lawson, the Dean, and I am delighted to be joined this morning by the Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart, who's joining us from Philadelphia. Good morning, Naomi. How are you?
Good morning, Dean Lawson. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome. And please call me Richard.
All right, Richard.
Absolutely. So before I introduce Naomi, will offer a prayer. And Naomi, I picked for our prayer this morning a 17th century prayer by Richard Baxter, who was a great kind of Puritan and poet. And this one feels good as Advent comes to an end and we look ahead to Christmas. So let us pray. Keep us, O Lord, while we tarry on this earth, in a serious seeking after you, and in an affectionate walking with you every day of our lives, that when you come, we may be found not hiding our talent, nor serving the flesh, nor yet asleep with our lamp unfurnished, but waiting and longing for our Lord, our glorious God, forever. Amen.
Amen.
Again, good morning. So, Naomi, I always love to ask our guests who are streaming with us and coming from another location, how does the weather look in Philadelphia this morning? What do you have on your end of things?
I don't want to make anybody mad, but yesterday it got up to 75 degrees.
Wow.
Now, today, when I walked the dog early this morning, it was cold. So I don't know what's going on, but we've had some pretty inconsistent weather.
You have. We've had
Yeah.
a really, in one sense, a lovely fall because it's been warm. In another sense, a terrible fall because we've not had much moisture, which is
Mm,
really frightening as we look ahead to next summer and forest fires and all of that. So it's been
right,
a
right.
strange fall. We're
Hmm.
overcast this morning, and it's cooler.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Well, Naomi, I'm delighted to have you for so many reasons. I feel like I'm so excited because I think you have, of all of our guests this fall, you have the most interesting array of hats, to use a metaphor. You are currently working for the city of Philadelphia, where your position is the director for faith-based and interfaith affairs. And we're
That's
going
right.
to talk a little bit about that, which is going to be interesting. You are also an adjunct professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. You're
Hmm.
an ordained minister, and last but not least, I discovered this morning that you are a good friend of our own, the Reverend Canon Katie Pearson, because you and Katie were in seminary together in Pennsylvania.
That's right. That's right. Hmm.
Well, that's just wonderful. Well, welcome. We're glad to have you.
Good to be here. Very good to be here.
So I want to dive in and start with talking about your academic work at Villanova.
Hmm.
Um, well, actually, no. Let's start actually not talking about your academic work. I want to start with your full time position there for the city of Philadelphia. Tell us about this. So, this director of faith based and interfaith affairs. How long have you been there, and what is this position?
So I've been there since October of 2019, so a little more than 2 years. Of course, got the position right before we knew anything about COVID-19 and a global pandemic. So much of my role has developed within the context of a pandemic.
Mm,
But I was hired to do, I'd say I have a threefold job. One is to set the table hospitably and inclusively for religious leaders and for people of faith in general here in Philadelphia. We've got an eclectic um, community of faith here. We've got multiple religious traditions represented. And as is the case in many cities around the country, our religious community is an anchor for many. Um, the provision of services, um, and the spiritual nurture and care of folk in Philly neighborhoods. And so it's important that City Hall be accessible to those
mm,
people of faith. It's important that I function as an intermediary. I even hate to characterize it that way because I don't approach the role in a kind of gatekeeping way,
Right.
but that I can be the liaison, the connection, the translator for people of faith about what's going on in City Hall. So that's one aspect of the role. I think the other aspect is to make Philadelphia the most religiously hospitable city we can be. So
Wow.
to make sure that our policies are taking into account the lives and experiences of people of faith, to make sure that all religious communities feel welcome and supported. So there is, in my view, a pastoral dimension of this role that I really appreciate. And then thirdly, I think that I'm sort of the subject matter expert within City Hall on issues of faith and matters of faith. I'm often the public facing representative for the Kenney administration. Jim Kenney is our mayor, on matters of faith. And so I'm often invited to do public prayer, invocation, or offer remarks, or short sermons, or whatever. Um, and so it's been a really great time to figure out how to remain faithful in a global pandemic, and how to partner with houses of worship to make sure that people can be safe as possible.
Mm. Fascinating. Is the position, well, actually, let me say one thing first. The one similarity between what you just said about your job and mine is I'm often invited to give even here at the cathedral, short sermons too, so I can appreciate
Hmm.
that adjective for
Hmm.
sermons. Is the position new, or how old is it?
It's not new here in Philadelphia. Two administrations ago, you remember when George H.W. Bush was president, he was the first one to establish within the context of the White House a federally supported office of faith based and neighborhood partnerships. I mean, the name has changed over time, but
Right.
and part of that was um, establishing a pool of resources that would trickle down to municipalities who also wanted to establish within the context of local government an office of faith-based affairs. And so the Philadelphia office has been around for a long time, and I am the first person to serve in this role in this current administration.
Mm.
So he's in his second term. And I have some peers in some other cities. Washington, D.C. has in the mayor's office an office of religious affairs, and New York has an office of kind of faith based partnerships within the context of city government. So I think it's increasingly an important and sought after capacity that local governments want to establish.
Wonderful. Well, let's talk for a moment about the other hat you wear, so to speak, and that is at Villanova. As an adjunct, I know you teach you're in the religious studies department, but you teach a range of subjects. Do you mind telling us about that?
Sure. So since the spring of 2017, I've been teaching at Villanova. Was brought on to teach a course that I designed called "Do Black Lives Matter to God?" This was, you know, a course that developed because you know, I thought the question was critical to ask. If we're going to say Black Lives Matter in a political sense, in an economic sense, in a social sense, I think we got to interrogate what it means to say that in a theological sense.
Mm.
And so this course is fundamentally about suffering and pain and evil and that age old question of theodicy. If God is good, if God is just, if God is powerful, then why does suffering persist? Why does evil seem to be victorious? Um, and I wanted to specifically ask that question as it relates to the experiences of Black folk in the United States, who have experienced disproportionate and, as I say, persistent suffering. And that the success of that course led to other opportunities to teach. And so Villanova is an Augustinian Catholic university that requires students to take a couple of theology courses before they graduate, no matter what their major is. And so when they come in as freshmen, they take a core fundamentals kind of course called Faith, Reason, and Culture. And so that got added to my plate. So I
Wow.
teach that course every semester for first year students. And then we have a Center for Peace and Justice Education, which is under the umbrella of campus ministry. So it's kind of a both uh, an academic department and a department that's in service to developing the public and political leadership of students. And so I teach a course in that department on faith-based organizing, kind of like an introduction to
Right.
faith-based organizing. So I'm delighted that I'm able to, especially as a non-Catholic, um, queer Black woman, teach at Villanova and introduce students to perspectives that they perhaps would not get.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah, it is. It
That's
is.
amazing. And just God bless you in that work. I know it takes a lot of courage and stamina. God bless you. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I would love for you to say a little bit about, and we're going to look, as you know, we're going to look at the Christmas story in a moment. But
Hmm.
before we do that, you also teach at Villanova um, Womanist Theology. Tell us what that title means, what this subject is, because it's not a new development in theology in one sense. It's as
Right.
old as Christianity in one sense, but in another sense, it may be new to some of our listeners. Do you mind telling
Hmm.
us about that?
Sure. I'm going to read a bit from I'm reading from Womanist Midrash, which is one of the resources I recommend to folks by Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney. There's her
Yes,
name there. Um, and because what I like what she does here is just explains the womanist framework in a really kind of clear way in this text. So
thank
I'm
you.
going to read here from Womanist Midrash. Womanism takes its name and draws its guiding and interpretive practices from Alice Walker's definition. So, parenthetically, Alice Walker, we know author, essayist, cultural critic, um, wrote a book called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And in that, she defines womanism. From womanish, opposite of girlish, or frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. A Black feminist or feminist of color. From the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you acting womanish,
Mm,
i.e., like a woman. Wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior. I'm going to skip around to my favorite part of the definition: loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless, committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female, not a separatist, except periodically for health. So that's an excerpt of Alice Walker's definition of womanism. And so Dr. Gaffney says, most simply, womanism is Black women's feminism,
mm,
right? And that distinction is important because I think womanism emerges from this lack of hospitality, lack of critical engagement and analysis of the experiences of Black women. So it emerges as a corrective, um, as an additional space for Black women to find themselves reflected, right? And so womanism doesn't start off as uh, isn't originally a religious kind of concept, um, but what Black women religious scholars have done over time is take this as a framework, as a lens through which they can see anew um, the Christian story, the Christian text, Christian narratives, Christian doctrines. Um, so it's an ideology, a perspective born out of Black women's frustration at not being able to find ourselves in the feminist movement. And what Black women religious scholars have done is say we're going to apply a womanist lens to biblical interpretation, to preaching, to pastoral care, to our general disposition of faith. And so that's a really kind of simplified, perhaps, definition of womanism. But I like what Dr. Gaffney does here in the first pages of Womanist Midrash.
That is thought-provoking and beautiful.
It is, and I, once I was introduced to womanism, there wasn't any going back for me to any other way of approaching faith. So it's a lifesaver to so many, and I wish that more folks had this kind of methodology, because they could get free, right? I think that this is fundamentally a liberation ideology.
Well, one of the things I love about that definition is I think, and I'm being a little speculative here, about myself in the past, and a lot of well-meaning white folks that I know that really want to get engaged in racial healing. And what I pick up on a pattern with white people sometimes, where we tend to only see it as being about the alleviation of suffering. Now we need that, God knows. And we sometimes, I think, forget that it's also about the increase of joy. That it's not just about pain, although God knows people of color have suffered in ways that I never have, nor suspect I ever will. But it's also about joy. It's about music. It's about the table. It's about all the things that you mentioned earlier too. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think that what womanism, a womanist kind of religious scholarship, tries to do is reject the notion that pain is our name.
Yep.
Right. That there's something ontologically pathological about darkness, right? Which is, I'm going to come back to that idea when we talk about the Christmas story and the Advent narrative, right? That there is joy in the midst of sorrow, right? And in some ways, that's the most revolutionary kind of joy, because it stubbornly fights its way, right, to the surface, despite the circumstances. And that, I think, is the beauty and the power of womanist theology.
Well, I hope we can have you back in person one day, and we'll do a class on. I've been thinking about for years. I don't know why I'm so drawn to it, but it's the beginning of Psalm 126. Weeping may spend the night.
Yes.
But joy comes in the morning.
Yes.
Well, let's look at that Christmas story. What would be, in your eyes, a womanist reading of the story of Christmas?
So I've got a couple of ideas here. First, I'll start with the notion of Advent and what happens in the dark, what happens in the interim, in the meantime, right? And there are lots of Advent narratives that I think sort of pathologize darkness. Darkness is something we want to avoid. Darkness is where the scary things are. But a womanist frame says, no, actually, read the text again, right? There's something going on in the darkness. There's possibility there. There's promise there. There's activity there. There's growth there. One of my favorite womanist theologians and scholars is Reverend Dr. Renita Weems. And she talks about the fact that some plants only grow in the winter, right? That winter is not a time of inactivity and death, but there's actually life emerging from the darkness. And so a womanist frame refuses to characterize darkness as evil or terrorizing, because we know that same idea gets visited upon dark bodies, right? And we see dark skinned people as terrorizing, as somehow ontologically suspicious and evil, right? So I think that that general umbrella of how we talk about light and dark uh, is an important womanist um, is an important womanist kind of critique
Mm.
of our traditional Advent narratives. Then I'm thinking this year about, Jesus. We say he was wrapped in swaddling clothes and he laid in a manger, and there was no room at the inn, and we sort of romanticize this story. It's so sweet, it's so cute. We put our nativity scenes out on our front lawns, and we talk about, oh, but this was a terrible situation to be born in. This nobody would want their child to enter the world in such kind of decrepit and alienating conditions, right? Thinking about the people who don't have an adequate place to stay.
Mm.
You know, the months get colder and they're forced to find makeshift shelters because there's no room, right, in the inn. And so a womanist frame would say, okay, we understand that these were the circumstances under which Jesus was born, and yet we don't want to reproduce these circumstances, right? Um, for the incarnated uh, image of God that's all around us, right? If it's really true that we are made in God's image, then we need to treat everybody like they deserve a warm and safe place to stay every single night of the year. So I'm thinking about housing insecurity and that connection to the Holy Family story. And then I think two more things. One, we often think about Mary and her commitment to saying yes. Let it be for me, that this is going to happen to me and this is going to radically change my life. But if we think about Mary's story within the context of consent, as it relates to bodily autonomy, if we think about Mary's story as it relates to Black maternal health, which we know is disproportionately poor, that lots and lots of Black women are dying in childbirth or shortly after. Um, we must see Mary anew as a frightened girl who whose life was changing, not because of decisions she made to determine her own fate, but because a decision was made for her and that put her in a precarious position. And she said yes. She agreed to be used by God. But what we should also consider is the cost to her of that yes. And so many Black women down through the years can celebrate and exclaim with pride that they said yes to whatever they were called to do. And there's the dialectic, right, of it came at a great cost to me,
Yeah.
right? And so holding Mary's story in tension is, I think, a womanist way. And then lastly, I would say that, Advent is the season of expectant waiting, as we, anticipate the wonder of God's presence with us. Again, I'm thinking about, Villanova has a degree program at a state correctional institution, and teaching theology in a prison has to, I think, change or at least interrogate your theology, right? What does it mean to teach about freedom when I'm going to leave this room, but nobody else, none of my students will be able to, right? So, by the same token, waiting, this notion of waiting, right? How have we made people to wait and told them, just be patient, just wait, just wait. And we ascribe a holiness to kind of being able to wait, right? Being patient in your waiting. But some folks, you know, should be able to push back against this narrative of holy waiting, to say, no, 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 I've been waiting long enough for my liberation. I've been waiting long enough to experience dignity, right? And I don't want to wait anymore, right? I've been in this interim place um,
Mhm.
long enough. And so, making sure that we don't make waiting so holy that we lose our sense of urgency around getting people off the waiting list for various public programs or getting people out of mass incarceration so that they can be reunited with their communities, right? So those are just a couple of things that
Mm.
come to my mind. You know, how should we approach some of the themes that emerge from this Advent and Christmas season using a womanist framework?
You thank you for all of that. Um, you use the word dialectic,
Hmm.
and what your examples in that word makes me think about is how opposites often are both are true and belong together.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
there's a poet that I love named Stephen Dunn, and he's got a poem. I can't remember the title, but he says in it something like this: that he came to love the shadows that illumination creates.
Mm, mm,
He came to love the
mm.
shadows that illumination creates.
I
Or
love that.
going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, that joy in suffering, one who suffered um, is perhaps able to recognize joy, and one
Mm,
who's joyful could morally be able to recognize and feel suffering.
hmm
Is
hmm hmm
is there some is there some truth in that, and does that relate to this lens in one way or another?
I think so. I mean, I think that simplification
Yeah.
and and absolutism are, I think, fatal to spirituality. I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, I think that, and what womanism seeks to do is, you know, what I say to my students, this is not a word, but complexify,
Yes.
complexify that thing,
Yeah.
right? Make it more complicated because life is complicated.
Yeah.
And black women know
Yeah.
the the um the task of the both and
Mm.
of uh of constantly trying to live authentically while undoing and unlearning some of the internalized, imposed um, characterizations that have, you know, sustained throughout, you know, U.S. history anyway. And so, yeah, I think figuring out the reading between the lines, right? Hearing
Mm.
the voices that aren't there but must have been there, right? The voices of people who must have been in the room, but who don't get their words and thoughts written down, right? That's what womanism seeks to do. So it's all about staying away from the absolutes and the blacks and whites, and moving into the space of complexity and nuance. Because that's where the beauty is. That's where the beauty is. That's where the full expression of human life is. We are not simply joyful, we also are heartbroken. And we're not only heartbroken, but we also experience these grand moments of joy. So, absolutely.
I want to draw a connection just very quickly, and then we'll shift to mental health. I want to draw a connection really quickly for some of our listeners, or for people who might watch this in the days and weeks to come. We had a guest earlier in the fall who's a professor of systematic theology, of all things, at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta.
Hmm. Hmm.
Her name is Dr. Kwok Pulan, and Kwok is her field and expertise is post-colonial theology.
Hmm.
And she and I did a Bible study together, and she said something that relates to what you just said about that womanist theology wants to pay attention to the voices that might be a little more subtle or have been excluded or missed, both in today's world and in the gospel stories or the Bible stories. And she said that post-colonial theology is doing something similar to that. It's paying attention to those voices that are just
Right,
quieter or hidden or implicit or ignored.
right,
So
right.
there's a relationship then, is there not, Naomi, between womanist theology and post-colonial theology?
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, in some ways, this is a form of redress, right? That
Yes.
for centuries of biblical scholarship, we have allowed
Yeah.
those voices and those perspectives to be ignored and dismissed. And so, what decolonial theology and what womanist theology tries to do is repair, um, uh, in some ways, offer kind of a reparations,
Yeah.
right? That done we've done our faith a disservice. We've done
Yeah.
God a disservice
Yeah.
by pretending that those perspectives aren't there and don't exist, or pretending that a certain kind of dominating perspective is normative, uh, and these others are kind of peripheral, right? It means bringing the peripheral to the center.
Mm,
So absolutely.
mm, mm. I want to shift to mental health.
Hmm.
So just a couple of things. I just, long story short, we've got kind of a big campus here in the middle of Capitol Hill in Denver. And on our campus is what's called the St. Francis Apartments at Cathedral Square. Long story short, it's about 50 apartments that is overseen by a nonprofit friend of ours, a great partner called St. Francis Center. And what St. Francis did using our property and building this apartment is moved about 50 people off the streets of Denver into an apartment. It's largely adults, although we've got one child who's a resident right now.
Hmm.
And I was talking with some residents over the fall, and I'd asked, if I do a new advocacy statement for the cathedral and Friends of the Cathedral, I'd like to talk about something from your experience that needs to be addressed as someone who is formerly experiencing homelessness. What would that be? And they quickly arrived at, you need to say something, Richard, about mental health.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so I just released an advocacy statement about mental health that was in part authored by a couple of residents next door. I've been really impressed with a document that you worked on in the spring of this year. And the title of it is The Department of Mental Health and Intellectual Disability Services. It's their report that they released for the city of Philadelphia. And you've got a short essay in it that I found really, really interesting. What are your thoughts, Naomi, on the relationship between homelessness and mental health? And in one sense, kind of thinking about it, I mean, I got to wondering in the last couple of months, about the relationship between being homeless and mental health, and that mental health is a kind of form of homelessness. It's a kind of
Mm-hmm.
absence of peace of mind where one doesn't feel quite at home within one's own body sometimes, and certainly within one's family and community. What are your thoughts on this relationship between mental health and homelessness?
Hmm. I think that, again, I go back to the theological. I think that so many of us learned that um, what it means to be healed is to be kind of free from any kind of abnormality as normativity is defined by the culture and by the society. Um, and therefore, we think that folks who are living outside of this normative paradigm, their bodies, their brains are just wired differently. They do different things than what is considered normative. Those folks don't are often not able to find a spiritual home, a theological home within the Christian church, right? Because cure is what we mean by healing,
Yeah.
not wholeness, not, as you say, peace of mind, not being fully integrated body and mind and soul, not feeling at home in your body, but cured is what we mean. So if you're not cured, if you're living with a disability, then you're still waiting on God to do something for you.
Mhm.
So I want to say that first, that first people are feeling spiritually
Yeah.
alienated because of the paradigm we have constructed, right? Um, and then, yeah, I think the structures and institutions of our society are enough to literally make you lose your mind. Now, I'm
Mm.
not, I think that people people are born in the bodies they're born in, and have to establish a relationship with those bodies, and sometimes that's kind of an antagonistic relationship, right? And I think that we cultivate despair and brokenheartedness, and we cultivate kind of uniformity, right? Such that if my brain is wired a particular way and I need XYZ accommodations to be able to get, I can't find that because we cultivate uniformity, right? Everybody has 60 minutes on this test, for example. We're not making any exceptions for that
Right.
or whatever, right? And so I think that then people end up homeless because we have made their bodies abnormal, and thus we don't want anything to do with them. We don't want to try to understand what's going on. We don't want them to understand what's going on, to be able to advocate for themselves, right? Um, and we've created a maddening system whereby if you are trying to get support, resources, a job, a house, there are 82 barriers to
Yeah.
doing so, right? And that is maddening, right? So, I guess what I'm saying is that that mental health care is not should not be, a luxury,
Yeah.
or, if I've got some extra disposable income at the end of the month. Mental health care is taking care of our minds, and the Bible does say that we should love God with our minds, our bodies, and our souls, right? And so loving God with my mind means that I take care of my mind, and I don't want to withhold care from other people who also are trying to take care of their minds.
Agreed. And that's one of the things that came out in the conversation with residents next door. One of the
Mm,
residents told the story. She said she's married, and she herself has Medicare and has pretty good mental health resources through Medicare. Her husband, who's working full time for a large company, if I said the name of it, you would all recognize it. He works on a factory line. You all know the name of it.
mm,
He has insurance, but no mental health insurance
wow,
because it
wow,
doesn't provide it. And
wow.
so that's one of the things we can all advocate for. Well, there are many things to advocate for, but health insurance needs to include robust mental health
That's right.
services.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Well, I want to shift one more time, and I'm gonna say as I shift to this question, I want to acknowledge the absurdity of it because we've got about 5 or 10 more minutes left. So I'm gonna say this is absurd that I'm even asking this. But you mentioned earlier that you teach this class on theodicy.
Hmm.
I think this question of theodicy is just below the surface of a lot of what we're talking about, and that is, how we believe in this good and just and intimate and ever active God revealed in
Hmm.
Christ, and yet, and a powerful God,
Yeah.
and yet God's world includes just such fragility and injustice.
Right.
Why?
Yeah.
How?
Yeah. You know, I teach this class partly because I'm so obsessed with this question,
Oh, really?
and I feel so unsatisfied
Yeah.
with the answers that the church has provided. Um, Everything from, things happen for a reason, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and pain is part of God's plan. That pain is kind of that suffering is kind of a curriculum that develops you and matures you, and
Yeah.
um, none of those are satisfying to me.
Yeah.
Um, None of those make sense to me in a rational sense or in a spiritual sense. How could a God who says that I am so beloved, right, permit my heart to be broken over and over and over again, right? Um, and I and we know that there's a practical significance. This is what I tell my students all the time, that theology matters um, not just because these are words about God, but because ideas about God have material consequences, right? If I think that suffering is part of God's design, I am not compelled to do anything about the suffering that exists in the world, right? Um, so I don't know, to be frank with you, I don't know why whole towns in Kentucky have been decimated, churches decimated, nursing homes decimated, factories. I, 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 I can't justify that. I don't understand that. I don't know why millions of folks have died due to COVID-19, who were just living their lives and breathing is what killed them. I don't, something they involuntarily do. Right? I don't know why Philadelphia has more than 520 homicides in 2021. Before the end
Mhm.
of the year, we had, I, but I think that asking the question pushes me to reject simple answers and simple solutions that just provide a band aid for what plagues us. So that's why I tell my students, we had our last class the other day, and we put God on trial. And that's why I have to come back, Richard. So I have to tell you about this trial that we do.
Mhm.
The jury, students, found God not guilty of neglect of Black people. That was the charge. God was brought up
Mhm.
on charges, right? And at the end of it, students are always like, we did the trial, we did the verdict, but I don't feel like I have an answer to the question. I came here to get an answer.
Yeah.
Do Black lives matter to God? And I don't feel like I have the answer. And I said, but do you feel courageous enough now to ask the question? And they're like, absolutely. I have some tools for investigation, right? My prayers are a little different
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
right? What I say to somebody who's suffering is a little different now, right? And that to me is a victory. Um, I don't know the mystery. I can't explain it to you, but I do know that God can take our questions and take our frustrating prayers, right? And so what I'm trying to do is cultivate some courage, so such that we do the wrestling, and don't run from the wrestling. So yeah, I this is my theological conundrum as a person of faith who's been in church all of my life. This is the thing that gives me a whole lot of pause. But I stay in there because God has promised to journey with me even in the wrestling. And so that's that's the best I can do.
Mm, 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 mm. I can't thank you enough for saying that, and with your for your patience with me in asking that question. Basically at the end of class. I you know how can we not ask that question? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it just is. It just to me is always below the surface.
Mm-hmm.
People of
Mm-hmm.
faith. Um, and to not ask it, I don't know, it just means we're leaving out a huge part of our not just our moral experience or our experience of injustice, but intellectually, it's leaving something off the table.
Sure.
And even if the question is reduced to how can we know joy, but yet at the same time tomorrow suffering comes. I mean, how do we live this just human experience, even if you leave
Right.
God out of it?
Right.
How does life contain these opposites?
Mm-hmm. Right. 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 And the skepticism, the exodus from organized religion, I think has a lot to do with
Yeah,
our refusal to look at the pain, to face it,
yeah,
right? I certainly was taught that, kind of this positive thinking, like, if I just, maybe if I look away from the pain, it'll kind of go away, but it doesn't. And it builds resentments, right? That my heart is broken, but I have a smile on my face because that's what I'm supposed to do. That's what I'm
yeah.
taught I should do. But instead, a much more honest way of being faithful is to say, my goodness, my heart is broken most of the time,
Mm,
right? Uh, I actually think that the gospel is, the good news for the brokenhearted. right? You can't get me to believe that Jesus was not brokenhearted the whole time,
Mhm.
you know? And so our faith doesn't mean that we won't be brokenhearted, but it means that there is good news
Mhm.
for the brokenhearted,
Mm.
right? There is liberation for those who feel bound by the injustices of our time, right? And so I want to sink right on down into the question, the despair, the suffering, the pain. That's when I feel honestly most faithful. Um, and so that's what I'm trying to do. That's my MO.
Well, I know that Jesus Christ is not in your class, and I'm certain Jesus had not read your syllabus. And this is Advent and Christmas, not Holy Week and Good Friday. But as Mark tells that story, the
Yep,
question Jesus asks on the cross is that question. My
absolutely,
God,
absolutely,
why hast thou forsaken me? That
absolutely.
is the question. As we wrap up, if someone who's listening, say, does not identify as a woman or is not a person of color, but is really curious about this
Hmm.
womanist lens,
Hmm. Hmm.
what would you say to them?
Hmm. Well, one is womanism in some ways sustains through community. So you can't be kind of a lone ranger, you know, applying a womanist lens, I think, right? You need to be in community. And so first thing I would say is find you a womanist minded community of folks who are committed to applying the same interpretive questions, applying the same, skepticisms and cynical questions to the life of faith, to the biblical text, right? Because this cannot thrive in a vacuum, right? The whole point is to get out of the silo and to get proximate to the folks who have been left behind and left out, right? So you need a community of folks, right? Even a digital community of folks. And then there are all kinds of resources. I pulled some stuff off my shelf for the good of the community. So Womanist Midrash by Will Gaffney, Hebrew Bible scholar. I love this. Ain't I a Womanist too? Third
Mm,
wave womanist religious thought. So as womanism itself evolves, womanist religious scholarship evolves over time. We revisit perhaps some of the principles and some of the norms. This is edited by Monica Coleman, who is a womanist theologian. I've got Troubling in My Soul, Womanist Perspective on Evil and Suffering by
mm.
Dean Emily Towns, who edited this volume. It's a wonderful, I come to it time and time again, teach it in my classes. And then Katie's Canon um, by our now ancestor, Katie Geneva Cannon, one of the womanist mothers who trained us up in womanist faith. And I wasn't fortunate enough to be her personal student, but I was like you mentored by her from afar. And here she's writing essays about the womanist journey. So these are just a couple of resources. Sit with those. Dr. Gaffney has just published a lectionary, a women's lectionary for the whole church. Again, approaching these texts from between the lines, from the outside, from the periphery. And so, build your library, build your womanist library, I would say, and build your womanist community.
Mm. Naomi, thank you. I
Mm.
can't wait to meet you in person, and I really hope you'll come and join us for a longer series one day here in Denver at the Cathedral.
I would absolutely be honored to do that, and look forward to it when we can be together in person. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, we're really really grateful. I hope I don't know how much you've got to grade between now and Christmas, but I
Oh
hope
my goodness, don't remind me, Richard. Don't.
But I hope that goes as well as it can, and I hope you have a good Christmas, and God bless you, and we thank you a lot. And for all who are joining us online, thanks for being with us, and know that our service of Holy Eucharist continues or begins at 10:30 a.m. at the same place, sjcathedral.org. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.